Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Valentina Bosetti, and I'm here to welcome today's CMCC talk on carbon border adjustment by Paola Rocchi. Paola Rocchi is a scientist here at CMCC. So CMCC is a leading research center focused on understanding the interaction between climate change and society. The mission is that of advancing climate research and using modeling, but also using other methods. But the main essence is that of supporting science-driven policies in the realm of climate change. We have three institutes. We are divided in three institutes, looking at Earth system prediction, climate resilience, and the socioeconomic component of the climate problem. And we also have 4 programs that are cross-disciplinary and that cover topics from the carbon cycle to artificial intelligence. One important element for today is that your audio and video are deactivated by default, but you can ask questions through the Q&A section of Zoom. So, as I said, today we're going to talk about carbon border adjustments. These are trade policies in a world that is changing and where trade is becoming something that we read every day about on newspapers. The link between trade policies and climate change is extremely important. So Paola, who has a PhD at University of Barcelona and has worked before at GRC, is going to today provide us new insights on the relationship between trade and climate change. The floor is all yours. Let's stop sharing.
Okay, many thanks. I'm gonna share my screen. Can you see it?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Okay, so first of all, thank you very much. I'm Paola. Thanks for having me. And so in this webinar, I'm going to present mainly this paper that is a joint work with Edoardo Campolobato, Alice Di Bella, and Valentina Bosetti, and is entitled Expanding Carbon Pricing Boundaries and the European CBAM, Insights into China and India. So, as the title suggests, the paper tries to provide an assessment of this European policy that is the carbon border adjustment mechanism. And the structure of the presentation is quite standard. So I'm gonna elaborate a bit more on the aim, the scope of this paper, then describe quickly the model, the tool that we have used, the scenario analyzed, and then I will go through the main results and some takeaway messages. After this presentation, as Valentina suggested, I would like to take some time for an extra content, let's say, that is not strictly related to this paper, but I would like to propose some reflections on this new policy landscape and the, let's say, trade implications and the implication for tools like CBAM. Before all this, let me spend a couple of minutes to frame the European CBAM, because I do believe that to properly understand and to properly assess CBAM, it's important to take into account that this is not a standalone policy. Actually, CBAM was proposed within the Fit for 55 package in 2021 as one of the 18 components of this package. And as you might probably already know, the Fit for 55 package was really the implementing arm of the European Green Deal and the European Climate Law, that is the package of policies through which the European Commission is trying to move from policy intention to practice. Besides that, regarding CBAM, what is important to highlight here is that CBAM was thought, designed, and then implemented after 2 years of legislative process as to complement the revision of the European ETS, the ETS reform. So let's see why and how. You probably already know what CBAM is. CBAM is, to simplify a bit the story, CBAM is a sort of tariff, that is a tax imposed on commodities imported into the European Union, but not all the commodities. This is a tariff applied to selected carbon-intensive commodities that are in particular cement, fertilizers, iron, steel, aluminium, and also electricity. So this is a de facto trade policy. But even if it is a de facto trade policy, as you have seen already from the first slide, and as the European Commission has repeatedly stressed, CBAM wants to be an environmental regulation, and it has an environmental scope. What is the scope of CBAM? Is to avoid carbon leakage. Carbon leakage is when production processes, in particular polluting production processes, move abroad from the European Union. So why do we need to avoid carbon leakage? Why is there the risk of carbon leakage? Exactly for the revision of the European ETS. The European ETS was implemented already 20 years ago. But for the so-called energy-intensive trade-exposed sectors, that are the sectors producing these commodities, the allowances are still granted for free. But this is clearly creating a distortion in the market, and the revision of the ETS directive foresees a phasing out of these free allowances. This phasing out of the free allowances might provoke carbon leakage. This is why the European Commission decided to implement gradually and simultaneously with this phasing out of the free allowances, the CBAM. The fact that CBAM has an environmental nature is also demonstrated by the exemption that this policy foresees for countries that are already implementing explicit carbon pricing. That is, if a trading partner has a domestic carbon pricing, it is going to be exempted from the application of CBAM. To provide you an idea about the size of what we are talking about, it is actually true that these commodities / industries are trade exposed. In the left part of the graph, you can see the share of these commodities that are imported over the total European consumption. These shares are quite relevant. And it is likely that there might be a certain degree of carbon leakage, meaning that becoming these commodities more expensive, firms might decide to move production processes abroad. And from the right side of the graph, you can see that production processes abroad are on average even more pollutant than the European production. Now, why have we chosen to look at CBAM? For many reasons, but I would say that probably for two main reasons. First of all, this is a quite interesting policy exactly for this dual nature, that is trade policy and environmental policy. Actually, there's already a huge academic debate on this policy. Here I've listed some of the papers that look at its design, its efficacy in dealing with carbon leakage, the implication in terms of export, retaliation, and so on and so forth. But again, the most interesting characteristic of this policy is that it lies in between trade policies and environmental policies. So it really has a nice potential impact in terms of mitigating asymmetries in environmental regulation. We will come again on this point later. But beside this point, we were really quite impressed by the amount of reaction in the political sphere. That is, clearly many countries raised concerns in terms of the CBAM acceptability regarding the World Trade Organization rules. although maybe nowadays the World Trade Organization is busy with more important tariffs. But besides this, it really seems that CBAM was able to provoke a renewed momentum in carbon pricing. There was, after CBAM proposal and implementation, there was really an increase in discussion, but not only in discussions, also in commitments to make progresses in adopting domestic carbon pricing. So given this framework, the aim of our analysis in the paper is basically twofold. On the one hand, we want to provide an assessment of this policy in terms of its environmental and macroeconomic implication and impacts. There are already many papers on CBAM, but now, given that we know the specificities of the policy, we can move from, let's say, theoretical conjecture to ex-ante policy evaluation, considering the specific scope and time frame of the policy. But besides that, we really want to try, to a certain extent, to take into account this international context where many countries are showing willingness to progress in their decarbonization efforts. We decided to focus on China and India for many reasons as sort of case study. These are very important countries in the international arena. They are export-oriented, and Europe is one of their main trading partners. They are also among the top global producers of the commodities that fall under CBAM. They contribute a lot to carbon emissions, but they do show important steps toward decarbonization. As a tool for this assessment, we have used the FIDELIO model. The FIDELIO model is a model that was originally developed by the JRC and is currently maintained and improved by both the JRC and CMCC. To simplify, this model is a recursive dynamic general equilibrium model. This family of model is particularly suitable for analyzing and assessing this type of policies, I would say, for two main reasons. First of all, for the granularity that these models usually offer. For instance, FIDELIO is based on the Figaro database, that is official statistics of Eurostat, is a multi-regional input-output table that covers 46 regions, and for each region, 64 sectors and commodities. That is already quite a nice level of disaggregation. Besides, there's also an extension of this Figaro database, that is Figaro E, that further split the granularity in terms of sectors and commodities, so it's possible to further specify the commodities that are under analysis. In terms of trade modeling, the bilateral trade flows are modeled here in a very standard way, that is through Armington elasticities, but for the moment this is still the most common way to model international trade with this type of approach. Okay, a few words about the scenarios. We start from the baseline, in which we already included the revision of the European ETS. For this exercise, the ETS in FIDELIO is modeled in a relatively simple way as a carbon price, but the ETS is not the focus of the analysis, and we still take into account the phasing out of the free allowances for the energy-intensive trade-exposed sectors. Then there is a first relevant policy scenario in which we introduce CBAM, and then we compare CBAM against the baseline. But again, probably the most, the novelty of our proposal is that we want to look at other policy scenarios. We want to take into account that China or India or both are decarbonizing, are making progresses, and are introducing more stringent carbon prices. Clearly, it's possible to make many comparisons. For in the paper, you can find more details. But for the presentation, I'm going to focus on two comparisons. That is, I'm going to look at the impact of the European CBAM compared to our baseline scenario, and then I'm going to look at the impact, how this impact changes if in our benchmark scenario, we take into account these countries' decarbonization efforts. So I have now a couple of slides of results for the first comparison that is the most traditional approach through which the CBAM is usually analyzed, and then one result slide for the other approach. So, looking at the environmental and economic impacts of CBAM, these two plots show the CO2 variation or deviation with respect to the baseline in percentage term, the first plot, and the GDP or sectoral output variation, always in percentage terms with respect to the baseline in 2040. The blue bars represent the variation at a country level, while the dots represent the variation of the variables at a sector level, where sectors or industries are grouped into high energy intensive, medium energy intensive, and low energy intensive industries, where high energy intensive industries roughly represent the CBAM industries, the CBAM sector. So now, these results are in the range of the results of the impact assessment of the European Commission, and are also in line with some new working paper and papers that are now being published about CBAM. Probably the most relevant results are that, first of all, in terms of environmental impact, we can see that if you look at the total CO2 variation, the last column, there's a marginal decrease in CO2 emissions. You can also see that there's a sort of redistribution across countries, but still the variations are really small, and the variations are even more negligible when we look at the GDP variations. Other details, for instance, if we look at CO2 emissions variations, we can also see that there's a minor increase for European countries. But we might, in particular for Eastern European countries, but we should pay attention on how to interpret this result, because probably this could be explained as the carbon leakage avoided through the CBAM. That said, this information is still relevant, and it is clear that it's important to put in action some other policies to avoid this. The effect in terms of CO2 and GDP is really negligible, but if we increase a bit the resolution of the analysis, and if we look at specific sector, the variation, both in terms of CO2 emissions and in terms of sectoral output, becomes a bit more relevant. We can see that, for instance, for European countries, the sectoral output in 2040 might vary about around 2%. Then, if we increase even further the resolution of the analysis, and if we look at bilateral trade flows, the impact becomes even more relevant. This graph is showing how bilateral trade flows changes, and bilateral trade flows here are again classified into high energy intensive commodities, the red lines, medium and low energy intensive commodities. And besides that, you can see importers in column and exporters in rows. So let's focus on the first column that represent European imports, that clearly are the flows that are more affected. And let's focus on the red lines, that is high energy intensive commodities, CBAM commodities. You can see here that the variation becomes quite relevant, and there's a reshuffling in the trade flows. There are countries or regions who are winning, in particular intra-EU trade, and also United States. Caveat, we are not considering in this analysis the current tariffs. And there are some countries that are instead losing in terms of trade volume, in particular countries like China, India, Russia, or the rest of the world. Now, Again, let's focus on the first column, and now let's focus on the second and third quadrant that are showing how much the European Union import from China and from India. The other approach that we want to propose in our analysis is, okay, this is the impact of CBAM, but what happens? How this impact, how the assessment of this impact change if we take into account that these countries are decarbonizing? And this is what is shown in this following slide. These two plots are representing exactly the same information as before. That is, how much of energy-intensive commodities Europe is importing from China and from India. Actually, the black line in this plot corresponds to the previous red line. That is how much the trade flows changes when CBAM is implemented. But then we want to propose this sort of also sensitivity analysis. We want to see how the CBAM impact changes if we take into account that China, the red line, India, the yellow line, or both countries, the green line, are implementing or are decarbonizing more. So a first result of this analysis is that CBAM is reducing export flows in all cases, but this result is actually is driven by an assumption of the exercise, because the carbon price in this analysis is exogenous, is taken from International Energy Agency projections. And these projections say that the carbon price in China and India is going to be lower, is expected to be lower compared to the carbon price in Europe. This is why CBAM is still affecting export flows. A second result is that an increase in these countries' decarbonization efforts significantly reduces the negative impact of CBAM, and this depends on the design of the policy, because again, CBAM foresees an exemption, in this case partial exemption, whenever a carbon price is applied domestically. Probably the most interesting result is that when one country decarbonizes, the impact on the other country is different. So let's, for instance, look at the left part of the plot that is representing how much China is exporting to Europe in terms of energy-intensive commodity. Again, the black line is the impact of CBAM without national ambition. The yellow line is the impact of CBAM when India is decarbonizing. Basically, nothing changes. If we look at India and we focus on the black line, again, no national ambition, and we compare this result to the red line, that is when China is decarbonizing, we can see that CBAM has a higher income on the a higher impact on this flow. Why? Because when China is decarbonizing without taking into account CBAM, India is gaining a comparative advantage, but CBAM becomes more costly for India in this case. So to try to draw some takeaway messages regarding this first part of the presentation, so about the CBAM paper. The first conclusion is again in line with the similar papers on the European CBAM, and is that the overall macroeconomic and environmental impacts of CBAM is negligible. But we do believe that is quite important to take into account in the evaluation of this policy, that is again complementary to the revision of the ETS mechanism. So probably for a fair assessment and evaluation of the environmental effectiveness of this policy, we should try to combine the evaluation of the two policies together. Second conclusion is that even if the impact on macro indicators such as CO2 emissions or GDP is limited, we have also seen that there are still significant impacts in terms of specific sectors, commodities, and specific trading partners. And this conclusion highlight the importance of keep investigating the micro level impacts of CBAM on these specific sectors or regions. And a final interesting conclusion of this analysis is that even if the macro impact of CBAM is not so relevant, we can see through our case study that to a certain extent this policy is able to play a role in this strategy of global incentives, prompting strategic climate responses. So again, in the case studies that we have focused on, when China accelerates its decarbonization process, we have seen that CBAM becomes more expensive for India. Therefore, it becomes more effective in pushing these countries toward more decarbonization effort.
Paola, if I may, there is a question, so that we take now questions
Sì,
about
sì.
the paper, because then you're moving to the next topic. So there's a question on the equivalent tariff in the case that you showed. So what is the tariff? How do you calculate the tariff? Meaning the CBAM tariff, and maybe what is the carbon pricing in China and India that is then deduced from the CBAM tariff?
Yes, so as I told you before, the carbon price is taken exogenously, and in the projections that we have considered, the Chinese and Indian carbon price is roughly half of the European price. This basically follows a bit the historical pattern of the European ETS. So the assumption here is that an ETS system requires time to be implemented. This is about the carbon price. Then the carbon price is affected on the emission content of the goods. So in the model, we do take into account the direct emission content of commodities. So is scope 1 of the CBAM is the one that is implemented now. So only the direct emission intensity of commodities, not the indirect. That could be another approach that we could try.
Okay. So I hope that answered. Otherwise, if there are further clarification questions, it would be great to see them on the Q&A. And I'll leave you the floor for the second part.
Okay, many thanks. Okay, so this is all about, with this slide, I concluded the part of the presentation that is based on our CBAM paper. Now, in particular, given the recent political developments that are strictly related to trade policy, I have put here 3 additional slides with a sort of extra content, and here is just a matter of reflecting a bit together, to put on the table some reflections looking ahead in 2 different directions. Well, one is more related to CBAM. So the first slide is gonna present some reflection on how recent developments might affect the impact or the role of CBAM type of policies. And the other set of reflection looks more into the modeling part, that is how should we and how will enhance our modeling tools to try to better capture this evolving trade climate nexus. So regarding the first proposal, that is some reflections more focused on CBAM. Again, there is no quantitative assessment here, just let's say that I see a couple of opportunities and a couple of risks. In terms of opportunities, so what we are witnessing now is this movement toward more protectionism. Unfortunately, this is still not clear, but unfortunately, sometimes when the national competitiveness becomes the priority, the environmental concerns remain a bit behind. If this is the case, CBAM type of policy, and I'm not referring only to the European CBAM, but also to the other CBAM type of policy that, for instance, Brazil is really evaluating, this type of policy really become more relevant to try to further limit asymmetries in environmental regulation, because from the literature, we do know that asymmetries in environmental regulation are unfortunately bad for reaching environmental goals. Another opportunity, still not clear, but I do think it's important to put this on the table, is the role of the European Union. Because if on the one hand it's true that already from the second mandate of this European Commission, the European Union has to a certain extent prioritized European competitiveness. The European Commission is still trying to maintain strong environmental standards. So let's say that the opportunity here is really that the European Union in this perspective tries to keep this direction, and there are good signals in this direction. For instance, one of the latest legislative proposal this February, the omnibus proposal, tries to simplify some of the policies of the Fit for 55 package, but not to limit their effectiveness, but instead to simplify its implementation. That is a good thing. In terms of risks, clearly this, let's say, regulatory instability is not a good thing, in particular if we look at the necessity of investment for the green transition, because this instability creates additional investment uncertainty. And this can even weaken the capability of CBAM type of policies of having a role in this, let's say, strategic play towards long-term decarbonization efforts. And finally, even we cannot put CBAM type of policy and traditional tariffs on the same level. It is true that CBAM is a trade policy, acts as a tariff. So the problem is that if we go towards a world where trade policy is more fragmented, the risk is that this part of CBAM is seen as a tariff more than an environmental policy. So CBAM risk triggering retaliatory measures, and this is not good for climate cooperation in general. The last two slides are instead of about what effort should we do in terms of modeling development to try to be able to better capture this trade climate nexus, in particular in these evolving trade dynamics. Clearly, to be able to properly assess this type of policies and these trade dynamics, we first need to really and deeply understand this nexus, the nexus between trade and climate. And we do know that this is not a simple nexus. Actually, there are many channels through which trade can have an impact on climate or on the environment. If we look at the literature, typically these channels are classified in four main set of links. There is international transportation that clearly plays a role, but also the scale effect, that means that trade affects the level of economic activity and therefore affect also the energy use and the emission. But another important channel is the composition effect, that is, trade strongly influences the sectoral distribution across countries for competitive advantage or due to global supply chains or due to outsourcing or offshoring strategies of multinational corporations. Again, trade has a strong impact on climate also through the channels of innovation and technological diffusion. So First of all, it's important to have in mind all these channels that are, by the way, strictly interconnected. And given this complex framework, we see three main developments in terms of modeling enhancement. And fortunately, these developments are already in our planned work stream. In particular, thanks to an Horizon project that started this February, the ENTICE project. And these enhancements are the following. First of all, it is really crucial to be able to move beyond the Armington trade representation. Again, this is the most common used in this type of approach, but it is really important to be able to include, for instance, firm heterogeneity, because firm's heterogeneity is in the trade dynamic what have an impact on the average productivity of firms, and the average productivity has an important impact on innovation. So it is really crucial to be able to model this part. Innovation and technological diffusion requires an additional effort in modeling, and this is also something that we plan to do, that is to better represent the dynamics of innovation, technological diffusion, in particular related to the technologies related to the green transition. And related to this point, another important modeling data and modeling development regards the sectoral granularity. Again, general equilibrium models compared to other approaches have already a nice level of detail and granularity, but we still need to improve this part to better capture, in particular, key technologies for the green transition. And this is not all. So, okay, this is not the whole story, because when we look at the trade climate nexus, it is not only important to be able to model all these different channels and their link, but it is also important to at least be aware that there are other, let's say, critical dimensions that really affects the final outcome of this nexus. For instance, the trade dynamics. Not all these channels happens in the same time horizon. There are some quick relations, such as, I don't know, the impact in terms of international transportations, but other channels require a lot of time to happen, like innovation or also changes in consumer preferences. So be able to understand these different time dynamics is crucial for this assessment. Then there are also other critical dimensions that act more as a sort of enablers. For instance, regulatory frameworks. We have seen from literature how the symmetry in environmental regulation matters a lot for the effectiveness of environmental regulation. Or again, institutional quality. We do know that it's important to have access to credit, for instance, or it's important to decrease as much as possible the uncertainty. Or again, the influence of stakeholders. All these critical dimensions are key to be able to properly assess the trade climate policy nexus. Now, probably trying to put all this together in one single modeling tool is not the appropriate or is not the most efficient approach, but there is another tool that we can use and that we are planning to develop more, that is the scenario space. And for this reason, within the ENTICE project, we are already working and planning to try to improve and to create a more targeted, trade-oriented scenarios that can really help us in assessing better the trade climate policy nexus and in providing a range of assessments, and also to be able to better compare the outcome of different modeling tools. Actually, this is all what I have prepared so far. Thank you very much for your attention. I don't know if you have any additional question. We can try to address these questions now, or if you want more details or if you want to keep discussing on this, we are very happy to have your comments also through email. Here you have my email address.
Okay, thank you. So we do have a question that is related to a specific sector, that the agricultural sector. So the question is, what are the implications of CBAM, I presume, for the agricultural sector and for suppliers of agricultural products to the EU?
Okay. The direct impact is not strong because agricultural commodities don't fall under CBAM, under the CBAM policy, but it is true that, for instance, fertilizers do. And actually, this is a reason why this type of approach is useful to capture the indirect effect of these policies, because usually in these CGE models, we do have information about the inputs used by different sectors. Agriculture sector is using fertilizers, for instance. I do not have results here, but specific on agriculture, I could check that, and I can provide through email more detailed information.
Thank you. So I have another question about you mentioned some simplification to the Fit for 55. The question relates to whether these are CBAM related or related to the CBAM configuration, or instead related to a broader simplification of other policies that are not CBAM, the CBAM component.
As far as I know, better to say, I do know just 3 legislative initiatives proposed in February. 2 of them that are more related to the Fit for 55 policies are really aimed at simplify the administrative burden of the implementation of these policies, not only CBAM, also other policies, but they are not targeted at decreasing the effectiveness of these policies. There is another initiative that instead is delaying a bit the implementation of policies, that is the Stop the Clock proposal. Stop the Clock initiative, but this is not related to Fit for 55 policies, is more related to policies that look at the reporting requirements of small and medium enterprises in terms of investments and sustainability of their investments. This is not a totally good signal, meaning that delaying these processes is not good, but it's also true that small and medium enterprises are struggling in facing the implementation of these policies in the timing provided by these policies. What I know is, for instance, that the requirement are going to be delayed from 2026 to 2028. So it's just a delay of a couple of years. So how much this is going to impact the effectiveness of the policy, I don't know.
We have some more questions. The first that I'm sharing with you is related to the little impact the CBAM has on CO2 emissions that you showed us. Globally, there is a very moderate reduction in CO2 emissions. And the question is whether there could be further or larger impacts if you were to account for the implications on innovation. So if you were to account for the fact that because of CBAM, countries outside Europe, for example, invest in innovation, etc.
To a certain extent, yes, but if the scope of the CBAM remains as it is now, that is scope 1, only direct emissions, only for the current CBAM sector, I wouldn't expect a great change here. What can do the difference is enlarging the scope of CBAM to more commodities or also to the indirect emissions embodied in the commodities imported. But again, I would like really to stress that for me is a bit misleading to look at the environmental impact of CBAM without considering the environmental impact of the ETS revision, because the ETS revision wouldn't have been possible without CBAM. European firms wouldn't have accepted the revision and the phasing out of the free allowances without CBAM.
Thank you. So I have a further question on the implication of CBAM on other countries. So it's hard to say that, for example, if India undertakes any decarbonization policy, that is because of CBAM. I mean, we can make those assumptions in designing the scenario, but it's very so one of the people attending the seminar is asking whether you think there might be a way to actually trace back to CBAM policies pushing to decarbonize, for example, India.
In my understanding, CBAM is absolutely not enough to justify or to explain greater decarbonization efforts of big countries such as India or China. Actually, it would be naive to do that. I haven't shown, for instance, some results that we have in the paper about the economic and environmental implications of a more stringent Chinese ETS or a more stringent Indian ETS. And clearly the environmental impact, but also the economic cost has a magnitude that doesn't have anything to do with the impact of CBAM. So it would be really naive to get CBAM this role, let's say. But on the other hand, I also think that somehow this is also a matter of dynamic strategic game in which CBAM did play a role. In fact, many countries really are progressing in their explicit carbon prices, and they are considering to implement CBAM type of policies. So even if there is no quantitative reason, at least in this type of analysis, if we would be able, and probably this could be a new research question, a new research line, but with different tools, to see the strategic dynamic, the strategic dimension of different players, I would say that CBAM might have had a role on that.
So many more questions. I'm trying to group them. A couple hint, and somehow also the previous one on innovation hint to do the use of revenues. So will the revenues be large? Will they be used to foster innovation? And what is relevant, the revenues from CBAM, or is it the revenues from not grandfathering permits?
Okay. Clearly, revenues use matters a lot, usually in this type of analysis. In this case, we have used a neutral approach, that is, basically we are neutral, meaning that we are redistributing revenues from CBAM to the European countries proportionally to how much they are paying for CBAM. Anyway, the smaller the GDP impact is, the smaller the ability of revenues is in terms of having an important role. That is, clearly also in terms of, for instance, foster investment. It can have a role. I think that there is an important story here that is not in our analysis, and unfortunately with this tool we cannot say anything about that because it refers to the less developed countries, because as I showed initially, the geographical coverage of FIDELIO is enough to analyze generally CBAM, but if we want to look at some less developed specific trading partners, we don't have that granularity. And probably for that trading partners, CBAM matters a lot. And I do think that part of the revenue is planned to be used to help these countries in their decarbonization efforts. Clearly, a different story is when we look at domestic decarbonization efforts. If China or India make progresses in their decarbonization efforts, the economic cost is going to be much higher. In our analysis, we have found, for instance, a 2% negative impact on GDP in 2040. That is high, but if you think in terms of yearly GDP is not so high, but still in that case, the amount of revenue becomes more relevant. So the use of this revenue can have a further impact in amplifying or reducing the decarbonization effort.
Okay, so two questions are related to EUDR expectation in general, thinking of agriculture and extending to the sector of agriculture, CBAM type of policies. So would the model, so this is not accounted in the modeling done so far, but would the model be able to...
Including CBAM, including agricultural commodities into CBAM.
Exactly.
Yes, that would be absolutely feasible. Again, we in the default version in the Figaro database, there's the agricultural sector, and in the Figaro data, this is further split in, I don't remember how many sectors, I think around 15 sectors. So that would be absolutely feasible, yes, and clearly interesting and might have a big impact. Actually, I do think that in that case, as in the case of fertilizers, Russia might have a strong impact, but again, also for Russia, the analysis is not taking into account the current sanctions, although I don't think that sanctions apply to fertilizers, for instance. But yes, it would be definitely feasible, this type of analysis.
So then there is a question about the Fidelio data set, so the data set in which Fidelio is built, and whether that allows you to calculate the CO2 emissions in extra EU markets. So some good categories are not explicit in the modeling, and so how do you plan to work to get more reasonable data on emissions for some specific goods, etc.
Okay, it is true that the Figaro database has this granularity that is 64 sectors and commodities. That is probably not enough when we want to, again, increase the resolution of the analysis and focus on specific sectors, but also specific technologies that are key for the green transition. There is already this Figaro E database that has the same coverage as Exio base, that is quite granular. That is, we are around, let's say, 200 sectors and commodities. And we have already worked during last year not only to be able to use this data to create some weights and to refine a bit the analysis, but to have a more flexible version of Fidelio that allow to disentangle the and split the sectors or commodities a specific analysis want to focus on. And this tool that we have developed is an R package that split all the database required by FIDELIO to be able to follow the specific, some specific sectors of commodities. Now, thanks to Entice, we will work also on the data part, and we will try to provide more granularity in terms of a database, in particular enlarging the resolution of the GTAB database. And this could be used as external information put into this split tool and then used into the model. And besides that, the split tool is flexible, and any additional data that comes can be used to improve the granularity of the model.
I guess that was the purpose of the last slide, but you kind of created some expectation showing potential scenarios to be analyzed. So there's questions on whether you can elaborate a little more on these scenarios. And you know, of course, we are at the beginning of, you mentioned several times the Entice project. And you can find more information on that project online, but maybe you want to provide a little more information about these scenarios.
Okay. Well, honestly, I'm not really able to elaborate a lot on this because, as Valentina already mentioned, we are really in the first steps of this process. And the first effort that we are doing is really trying to improve our understanding of this complexity, because we do believe that it's important not to leave aside things that are that matters. For the moment, we have been working on this first approximation in which we are taking into account these two dimensions, that is trade openness on the one hand and climate ambition on the other hand. And the idea is to try to offer different scenarios. For instance, a scenario in which we have in the totally positive side where finally this protectionism wave will not have a long life. Countries will decide to keep trade openness and also prioritizing climate ambition. This is going to be a sort of a green internationalism. In the other extreme, we can imagine a world where this trade fragmentation continues and becomes more relevant, and where, due to this competitiveness, climate ambition is weakened and becomes secondary to competitiveness. This is sort of fossil fuel protectionism. And so on, we can try to develop different scenario-based analysis. But again, this is just the starting point, because there are really other dimension that matters a lot. I do believe that, for instance, it would be very important to be able to introduce some dimension in our scenario space in which we do take into account institutional quality again. An environmental regulation or the nexus between trade policies and environmental regulation might have a totally different outcome if we are in a world where firms have access to credit, or if we are a world in which instead there is instability and countries cannot access freely to this credit. And again, our modeling effort might have some theoretical background, but still the real world matters a lot. So take into account how stakeholders are able to influence the political process, the political decisions, is really important. This can be done through, again, scenario space, but this could also be done, and this is something that we are also exploring, by evolving, by exploring our capability of linking, soft linking or hard linking different modeling tools. For instance, in this case, I think that agent-based models are very good in providing information about stakeholders' dynamics and influences, and coupling different modeling approach might be another solution in this case.
Okay, you have last minute for the last question, but I just want to tell everybody that yes, the seminar is recorded, is on the YouTube CMCC channel. So the last question is, as Chinese imports go down in the specific scenario, in the CBAM only case, there will be substitution with domestic production. Does the model account for production capacity and investment required to expand this? I mean, is the model capable of mimicking this?
Yes.
Okay, so the model is capable of doing that, and we did that within the time allocated to us. So thank you. You can re-watch the seminar and ask questions via email. It was a pleasure to have you here. Have a great day.